Good morning, everybody. It's good that you all have come back. I suppose you were all here yesterday, right? I'm not going to talk about Agile today. I'm not sure if you're hoping for that or have had enough of Scrum bashing for one day. So I'm going to be talking about frameworks today. So this is not a talk about comparing frameworks and what they do and what they don't do. It's a talk about how frameworks can get you into trouble. It's basically not the frameworks, because using frameworks is a good thing. I use frameworks. I've been building and using frameworks for almost 25, maybe even 30 years. So using frameworks is good, but it can also get you into trouble. And I'm going to try to illustrate that it can get you into trouble. And I'm going to show you some tiny bit of pattern stuff that can help you move away a bit from this trouble. So I'm not really sure whether these patterns I'm going to show you in the second half of this talk will apply to your case, but they did apply to mine, and well, I'm talking from real everyday practice. So hopefully you will bear with me for the next, let's say, 87 minutes or so, which is quite a long talk. So I've put in some movie clips as well to illustrate the points I will try to make. So again, did anybody see my keynote yesterday? Because that saves, well, not everybody, I guess. So I reintroduce myself then. So my name is Sander Hoogendoorn, which is Dutch, of course, because we're probably the only people in the world that have the in the speech. You probably are not even able to do that, right? It's a horrible sound, I know. So I work for Capgemini, small little company. We employ around 140,000 people around the world, of which there are around 6,000 in the Netherlands, and I'm not really sure how many there are in the UK, but it's quite a lot. I have a peculiar function title called Principal Technology Officer. Don't be scared by that, because it doesn't mean anything. It's just that I'm busy doing technology stuff. That's basically it, and I try to help my clients and our company on the road to being more agile for some time and trying to use technology better and improve on that, et cetera, et cetera. I've written some books. I'll show you in a sec. Some articles. It must have been more these days, because this is a fairly old slide. This is my personal blog. You'll be able to find much more about lots of subjects there. And this is my Twitter tag. I just posted a photo of you on my Twitter timeline. So with the new functionality out there in Twitter, you can now tag yourself in the photo, right? That's cool. If you tweet at all, by the way. So, these are my books. This is German, by the way. It's actually the same book as this one, but they changed the title. And somebody in German said it looks a lot like something they call das kleine Arschloch. I'm not going to translate that, but you probably, well, you should try that. It's not a nice word. So this is the book in English. It will be coming out, hopefully, possibly even this week, and depending on the speed my publisher is getting. Otherwise, it will be out in, like, say, 2 weeks. And it's, again, the same book as this one. So, apart from doing all this stuff and being on stage and writing stuff, I'm also a developer. I write code. That's what I have been doing for 32 years now, 33 actually, in very different languages. I spend most of my time writing in C#, but does anybody do Java here? Okay, there's always a few. So I'm now in a Java project. And that's an interesting change of scene for me. I have been doing Java projects before I ran into .NET, but anyway. So just to give you an example of me doing development work, I was in a big project where we are writing, oh, actually it's finished already now, it's in production. It is actually in production, that stuff happens. I was quite surprised about that too, but there was a very big COBOL installation in the Netherlands for the Social Security Agency, like 10 million lines of COBOL code. That was only the one application, and there was another application that had like 23 million lines of code in there, and they couldn't get rid of it. So it runs on a mainframe, and they couldn't get rid of it, so they decided to put an ASP.NET web application on top of that. So we built that, and I was writing some JavaScript to test whether I could actually block people from moving away from a page when they already had typed in some of the fields, and stop them from killing their browser and stuff like that. And it seemed to work, and I was testing it out a bit and still fiddling around with it. And then the project manager, in all his wisdom, decided that he wanted to give a demo to the CEO of the client. And after about an hour, I got an email from him with a screen grab from the application. And he said to me, "Do you think there's any more of these message boxes popping up?" And I was like, oh yeah, that's what you get for demoing untested code, right? It's your own fault. he was really pissed. I don't know why. These things happen, right? So that's me being a developer. So this is the agenda for today. I'm going to talk a bit about frameworks, and I did a little survey online to see what people are doing. The survey is getting older. I have to probably redo that. And then I'll try to illustrate to you how frameworks can get you into trouble. And I'll talk a little bit about software architecture, because you always have to do that, I think. And some small patterns. This is not the whole solution, of course. There's many, many patterns that can help you do this. But these are ones that are usually not that visible to people, but they are always there in your source code. So let's start off with the first topic. So the thing is, I love frameworks, right? I love working with frameworks. Even more, I love creating frameworks. I'm actually now writing a framework in Java. And that's pretty cool. And the thing is, if you put Java developers together and you don't give them a decent task that will fill their time, they will be constructing a framework. That's what they do. It's just in the nature of people. So I'm working with this team of around 20 developers, and well, the first thing they did is they didn't build functionality. They start writing a framework, which is cool, of course, but it still has to prove that we can, if we can use this framework, that we can actually be more productive or produce higher quality code, et cetera, et cetera. So we're just starting this thing. So about frameworks, I did a little survey, and it might be a bit stale, but still it's an interesting view about frameworks. So the first question I said was, what benefits do you have by applying frameworks? And people say, well, we develop software faster. Good, right? Well, basically, you could do that. You have to write less code, and all the code that is repetitive you can leave out, and the framework should be able to handle that, depending on the framework you use. Also, people say we have a much better software architecture by using frameworks. I doubt that, actually. And the reason for that is that people will see the collection of frameworks that they have as their software architecture. And I'll try to illustrate to you that it's not. It's the other way around, right? You have to have a decent software architecture, create some pictures of that, and then find out which frameworks suit your software architecture. To me, that is a much more viable approach. Adding new features is easier, probably. Our software has become much more stable. I believe that, yes. Because if you use frameworks, you assume that the quality of that code has been proven, right? It has been used over and over and over again. But then again, assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups. So let's see. So we develop software faster. And then I checked in, because I partly, or for a larger part, live in the Microsoft world. I said, okay, so what kind of frameworks are you using, right? Are you using the basic Microsoft frameworks? Because Microsoft has put out a lot of frameworks, right? So if you're in the Java field, Microsoft puts out a framework like, by the way, is anybody working for Microsoft here? Okay, so I can bash on them a little bit. They put out new technology about every 3 months, right? And the moment you think, okay, I'm going to use this one, they put up a better version or a newer version or a different technology. Basically, if you go to Microsoft Tech Hat, do you go to Tech Hat or other Microsoft organized conferences? They have been doing, I've been doing Tech Hats for like years and years. They do the same demo, getting data from the Northwind database, putting it up on a screen for at least a decade, right? Using a new framework every year. That's actually quite cool if you're building frameworks, right? But is that making us more productive? No, it's just changing the frameworks we use. So then there's also a lot of people also in the Microsoft world who use open source frameworks. If you go to the Java world, there's even more open source frameworks. And there's a whole bunch of them, I'll show you. And then there's a lot of people that write their own frameworks. And I love that. I love looking at people writing frameworks and using frameworks. And there's good stuff in there. Sometimes it's better stuff or more appropriate to your specific project than the stuff that is out there in open source or in the Microsoft stack or in the Java stack. So that's good. But the thing is with frameworks, they are usually either only providing part of the functionality that you actually need, or they're providing too much functionality. There's hardly frameworks that do just what you need, right? And it does make sense, because it's very hard if you build a framework to figure out what people are going to use it for. You don't know, right? So you have to figure out. And then I made up a list of things that, so what if you start using frameworks? What will happen? So what are the things you encounter? Like stuff like, okay, which frameworks are we going to use anyway? And trying to convince your management that you actually need a framework, especially when it's not for free. Like most of the UI components that are out there in the Microsoft world, they're not for free, right? You have to buy them. You have to buy licenses of them, or et cetera, et cetera. So in my company, it's already hard to convince my management that I need a ReSharper license, which is just, well, it has a return on investment for about half an hour, right? It's the time you spend in finding files can save you a lot if you just, well, I'm not commercializing ReSharper, but it's even hard to convince people buying simple licenses of simple tools, let alone buy a framework, because how do you prove to your manager what the return on investment is for a framework, right? That's very hard. So there's lots of this stuff, and I'll go through that with you. Let's start off with the first thing. Well, I like movies, as you can see. The first thing is, if you look at frameworks that are out there, they're out there in different categories. There's the frameworks that do it all, right? So it's stuff like Microsoft Enterprise Library, or like, well, all the Spring stuff that's out there in the Java world and in the .NET world. And there's the Castle project, and you could say, well, there's lots of these frameworks that have functionality for just about anything you need, right? And then there's the second category that is actually targeted at a single specific element, like a single specific layer in your architecture, like the UI layer, or the process layer, or the workflow layer, or just doing domain-driven design things, or just doing persistence. So there's lots of layers, lots of frameworks that that you work with in one specific layer. And then there's the third category, which is also very interesting. There are frameworks that target with one specific niche field, like doing dependency injection, or doing logging, or doing search engine stuff, or whatever they do. So there's a whole bunch of them out there. And looking at these three categories, you have to figure out which one will suit you most. You can either use, let's say, a collection of these layer frameworks, or you can use layer frameworks in combination with these, or maybe you can just use one of these do-it-all frameworks and be happy with that and build stuff around that. So the question is, how to choose? So this you all know probably. This is the Coplex website, and it has around 30,000 projects in there. Not all of them are useful, but quite a few of them are. How do you choose from 30,000 frameworks? That is really, really tough, right? So what a lot of people do is look at this website and say, this is too much, I'm just going to use ASP.NET MVC, Entity Framework, and I'm done, right? Who of you is doing just that? Well, only a few. So the rest of who builds their own frameworks? Okay. Who's using open source? Okay, so that's a good division. So there's lots of this stuff out there. And if this would have been the only source of truth as it comes to the frameworks that you can find, it's not. There's multiple websites of these. There's stuff everywhere. And it's very hard to find out where to pick from. Like the Microsoft, and this is an old picture, of course, but the Enterprise Library, who of you is using Enterprise Library blocks? Yeah. Well, it's okay. You can raise your hand if you do. It's not nothing to be ashamed of. It's just a bunch of frameworks, and they're quite good. So the thing is with these frameworks, and there's even more, is that if you look at them, and you look at the websites, because they all have a website, right? If you look at those websites, and I just picked on an arbitrary one, I sort of ruled out the name of the framework and the vendor because they asked me to. Basically, I had their website up on my slides, and they said, would you please not do that? I said, okay. So I'm going to make it anonymous. So this goes for any one of these frameworks, right? And if you look at the text in the commercial websites they have, it's horrible often. So they say, like, it is an open, blah, 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 is an open source web application framework based on Microsoft.NET and something else. The aim for blah, blah, blah is to make life easier for system developers, and there it comes, by providing a highly competent component toolkit that increases the productivity and the quality of the system. How do they know? I don't know, and I don't know what the framework does, but it seems to be quite good, right? And the funny thing is, every website you go to makes the same promises. It's similar to if there's a new version of Microsoft Office coming out, they usually advertise it with, use the new Microsoft Office. You will become 80% more productive. And I'm never sure what they mean by that, because it doesn't make me type faster in Word. The numbers aren't added up faster in Excel, and still I can become 80% more productive. How does that work? Do they block all my email or something, or what do they do? So it's a bit like advertisement, right? This is in Dutch, I know, so I'll translate it. This is an advertisement for shampoo I found, and it promises to give you 80% less split hair points. 86%? How did I count that, right? And it's the same kind of promise. It's very hard to meet up with those promises. So if you look at these websites, don't believe what they're saying. It might be true, and it might not be, right? And it's not because they're making a mess out of it, these frameworks producers. It's just because your situation might be slightly different than the one they prepared it for. So, first of all, this is the tough part. It's trying to convince the management that they actually should invest in frameworks. Because investing in a framework is not just, oh, we're going to download it, or we're going to buy it and install it, and or get a NuGet package or whatever you do. It's much more than this. Because there's lots of stuff that's coming out. If you start using a framework, you have to learn about it first, right? And there's lots of investment involved in starting to use with a new framework. Don't underestimate that. So the question your managers will ask, what's the return on investment? How soon are we making money out of this? How fast are we saving time by using this framework? How much less bugs will there be in the applications if we use this framework? Do you know? Well, you don't. And probably you will never know, because there's so much influences on how much bugs you have in your project. It can be because maybe you hire a new programmer who's really, really good at the same point in time that you start working with a new framework. Maybe you even hire the guys who built the framework so they can produce quality code, so your bug rate will go down. So there's lots of stuff that influences those return on investment figures, and it's very hard to make a commitment to a manager. So my manager, is this recorded? Oh, he doesn't look at it anyway. So my manager, he says, well, I don't understand why you guys need an SSHD in your laptop. And I said, well, first of all, it's called an SSD, right? And, and that gives you if you have trouble convincing your manager that you need an SSD, actually he bought one for me now, but that you need an SSD, how can you convince a management that you want to use a framework? Or worse, build your own framework. It's tough, right? So the next step is, you have to understand what this particular framework does. And if you look at the frameworks these days, they do a lot of things, right? I was in a session yesterday afternoon where Michael Kennedy explained a bit about the new routing mechanisms in ASP.NET MVC5. And I was looking at it, and I thought, okay, this is only one aspect of one framework, and there's so many out there. How can you keep up with all this new technology? That is tough. And you have to understand, and the thing is, if a group of developers starts looking at a framework, they will see different things in it, right? For sure. And they will have different ideas about what this framework can do for you. And you have to sort of unify that and see if you can find a good use for your framework. And then you have to convince the other developers, right, to use the framework. So this is basically a predominantly Microsoft-oriented conference. So I've put up this picture. I do this talk also at Java conferences, although with .NET code examples. So then I reverse it. That usually works. And, but it's sometimes hard. I have a whole bunch of Java developers in my team now. And we're looking at frameworks and building up a tiny little bit of framework ourselves. And with every line of code I type, that's basically because I come from the .NET world, they look at me typing and they say, why are you typing this line of code? Literally. There's a guy behind my back. Hi, Eric. He's probably watching the video next week. And he's saying, okay, why are you typing this code? And they're convinced I will type in .NET code, which I do because I put the curly brackets on another line, and they don't, right? That's the big difference, I guess. So you have to convince your other developers. And once you've done that, if you are able to do that, then you need to train people, because you need to train people to use the framework in the same way. I hate it. I like freedom as a developer, right? But too much freedom can give you, if you have like 20 developers on your team, they all have their own, like, let's say, their own handwriting, right? Everybody has a different style of writing code. And I can easily recognize the styles of code from my colleagues. They write slightly different things. They name variables slightly different than I do, or so you can easily recognize it. And you also have to try to unify that. And it's just for keeping better maintenance afterwards and stuff like that. So if you've trained them, so you're good to go, right? You're free. You can use the framework, build all the code you need, build applications faster and better and whatever you do, and you're on top of the hill and you're going right. So that's the point in time where you have to realize a couple of things. I'll try to illustrate that to you. So you also can get into trouble with using frameworks. Again, using frameworks is good. Building frameworks is also good. But you have to be aware of a couple of things. One of the things is, what happens if the framework you're using is lacking a few features that you actually need? What do you do? So what do you guys do? What do? You build it yourself, you add it to the framework, and if it's open source, you commit it back to Git or wherever it is. You do that? You're a quiet audience, by the way. But it seems to be normal in London. I don't know. So most people will try to add it to the framework, right? Or try, if it's open source, you can look at the code and you can add your own stuff to it. And before you know it, you'll be writing code inside of the framework. That's okay, but not when a new version comes out that you're going to use. Because you will lose your own code, right? It probably not be in the same place, in the same location. Structures will change, etc., etc. So that's the hard part. Where do you put that type of code? So what if somebody in the project decides that another framework will be better than the framework you're currently using? I have been in that situation many times. And it might even be the case, because I'm away from my project now for a week, that when I get back on Monday, they will have changed the implementation of the frameworks and have changed the frameworks altogether. That's a risk. So I better not go to conferences because my code might change underneath me. So anyway, so another example I give you is that a real example that happened. There was a Java project that used the CMS framework for doing CMS stuff. And they had been in the project for like a year, and they decided to move to another framework because it did the stuff better than the framework they were using, and it wasn't performing really well. So they didn't talk to that about the client, and this was an agile project. So they got the framework out, moved another one in, and they didn't produce any decent features to add to the project in 3 iterations. So there were like a total stop in productivity for 6 weeks. And when the client found out, he was really pissed about it, because he said, well, you should have informed me or asked me if I was okay with that. And he wasn't. So he canceled the project. He actually did. So this is tough, right? And even if you can sell it to your client that it's necessary to do this, technically, it's not always that easy to get a framework out. Because before you know it, you will have references to classes in your framework everywhere in your code, right? So then it will be very, very hard to get it out. So what if the framework you're using has bugs in it? What do? Well, you program around it, right? And if you do, and a new version of the framework comes out that you're going to use, you better be aware of the fact where your own code is that works around the bugs that are in the framework. Or if you're in an open source project, you're using an open source project, and they suddenly stop doing that. So no new features will be added. Or they fork it and go into another direction, and the main branch you were on is stopping, right? So stuff like that happens. And you think, oh my God, there's not going to be new stuff in here. What do I do? Well, of course, you can start contributing to the other version of the framework, or just kill it altogether, right? These are tough decisions to make. And this thing, you might say this doesn't happen, right? Because if new versions of frameworks come out, they're always backwards compatible. No, they're not. Do you think they are? Who of you think now? Well, nobody thinks that, right? They will be different. And I'll show you examples of that in a few minutes, because they actually will be. And this is the problem that is actually going to kill your project. Is any framework that you use, if it's all around you, let's suppose the gray rectangles, or rounded rectangles actually, are the framework you're using, and the yellow ones and the orange ones are your own classes, you will never be able to get rid of this framework. Never in your life. You will get stuck with it for years and years to come, right? And the thing is, that is not always a desirable situation. And I'll show you why. So first of all, I promised I had some movies in there. First of all, looking at framework developers and application developers, it's not the same breed, right? A framework developer has to think about all the different uses that you can have for your framework. And if it's an open source framework or it's a vendor framework, there's a lot of different situations that you can actually apply the framework to, right? And they have to take care that in any one of these situations, the framework will work. And then there's the people who write the actual applications. These are the people that are in there with their meat, right? They have to work with this stuff. And they will start complaining about, it just doesn't do what I need it to do. And if you look at the feedback that you get on websites about frameworks, it's usually, well, there's a lot of negative feedback on those frameworks because, yeah, well, it doesn't work in the way I want it to, and it doesn't have the feature that I need, et cetera, et cetera. But for a framework developer, it's really hard to come up with all the situations that your framework is going to be used in. And it's a bit like in this particular movie clip. I hope it starts from here. Oh, I have to press a button, I guess. La da 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 da. So you know this movie, right?
Yes, I'd like a ham and cheese omelet or wham fries.
I'm sorry. We stopped.
This is an interesting situation.
We are on lunch menu now.
So Michael Douglas is the client, right?
I want
and he is
breakfast.
going to use
Well, you can't have it when I'm serving
the
you.
features of the framework.
So you said. Is that the manager?
Yeah,
And
Can I
the
speak
framework
to him,
is not
please?
offering those features, right?
sure. Rick, there's a customer that would like to speak with you.
Yes, sir.
Typical, the manager.
Hi, I'd like some breakfast.
We stopped serving breakfast.
See, we don't have
Why
that
you
feature
stop
anymore.
serving breakfast, Rick. Sheila told me you stopped serving breakfast. Why am I calling you by your first names? I don't even know who you are. I still call my boss Mister. I worked for him for 7.5 years, but I walk in here all of a sudden, total stranger. I'm calling you Rick and Sheila like we're in some kind of AA meeting. I don't want to be your buddy, Rick. I just want a little breakfast.
Well, you can call me Miss
Feature to
Folsom
be the
if you want.
framework.
Sheila, we stopped serving breakfast at 11:30.
Sorry. New release is coming out, right? Lunch.
Rick, have you ever heard the expression, the customer is always right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, here I am, the customer.
That's not our policy. You have to order something from the lunch menu.
Right, you have to use the new
I don't
features.
want
The old features are not
lunch.
present anymore.
I want breakfast.
Yeah, well, hey, I'm really sorry.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm really sorry, too.
So hopefully, so the management and the guys in the restaurant, they are the framework builders, right? They move to a new insight, so they change the way things work. And the guys who are using the frameworks, the actual customers, are not always, as you can see, happy with that. But it happens. So, and the thing is, you get so depending on this stuff that it's very hard to move away from it if you want to. So if new features come out and they break it, and you have to rewrite a lot of code. So this is an entity data model, and it goes with the entity framework. So I'm using here these old versions, right, of entity framework. So if you look at the code, you can see that the course class in this particular code sample is inheriting directly from entity object, which is a root class in the entity framework. If you do that, and you say, hey, all my domain objects, because course is clearly a domain object, inherit from a class from the entity framework, it means that you automatically get all the behavior that this class has. And it's quite a lot of behavior. So what if you don't need all that particular behavior? Or maybe even, if a new version comes out of entity framework, is there a guarantee that this behavior will still work, right? So the question is, should you really be inheriting from this particular framework class and be so depending on not having changes in the framework? So you get stuck with, I don't know what, this is entity framework 2, I guess, with entity framework 2 for the rest of your life. And you will have to support it for the rest of your life, right? So that's tough. So that's one thing. And the next thing we do, and I do it too, and most developers do that. They look at new stuff, right? You're here to look at new stuff that's out there in the field. And some of that stuff is still in beta. Or it's brand new, it's version 1 or whatever you might have. And you know if that happens, that stuff will change, right? So I have this, and if you do that, there's another movie clip in here. If you do that, you can go really on the wrong track. I'll show you the code samples first before I show you the movie. Because technology is moving so fast that it's very hard to keep up. Every time I do this presentation, I update this list. And there's no way in keeping up with this, right? There's no way that you will actually be able to be aware of all this stuff that is out there. Well, Silverlight, well, it should actually be moving right there, right? So this is not a judgment on the technologies, right? This is just saying, okay, they are moving away from that and moving into new stuff. I had a discussion earlier this week about the language M. Do you still remember the language M? Well, some of you do, right? Did you actually use it? No, nobody did, right? Same goes for M grammar, by the way. But so this stuff that came out like, I don't know, what, 5, 6 years ago, and that they were pushing really heavily. Nobody's using it anymore because we moved away from it. As the same thing will happen to stuff that is here. Even though you might think this is not going to happen. We're going to do Razor syntax for the rest of our lives. You will until they come up with something new. Right? That's the way life goes in software development. And it's very hard to keep up with stuff. Just as you started to get used to something, they will have something new. And as soon as I tried out Metro, and I built my first app with it, something new came out. We're going to do some stuff different. Or somebody says, well, so my previous manager had the strategy, we're going to move into Windows Store apps, and we're going to do that, and we need our frameworks to be working with that. So we did that, my team and I, and so we had a framework set up to do Windows Store applications, and then it appeared that nobody's using them. This might be a bit black and white, but I tried to update them this morning on my laptop, and only a few of them. Well, actually, I had 18 applications that needed to be updated in the Windows Store. And I looked at them and I said, well, I have never used these. Why do I do this, right? So, okay, so we moved away from it. We spent tons of time investigating how the stuff works. And we now know, but it's not useful knowledge anymore. And that's only like a year in the past, right? So that's tough. So for instance, if you look at this one, this is a piece of code from a project we did in Belgium with the first betas of ASP.NET MVC. And we built a big application with it. And I was talking to the software architect in that project, so it's a while ago, and I said, well, are you sure you're going to do this, right? Because he said, yeah, it looks quite stable, and it's good, and it's not going to change and stuff. And so this is the beta, right? So if you look at the methods here, they still have this render view thing at the end, and they're void. So when version 1 came out, they had changed that implementation. For the better, of course, for the better. So now it looked like this, right? You had action results as a return value from your methods in your controllers, which is slightly different than this implementation. And they needed the version 1 features. The stuff that was newer than in the beta, I don't know, it had to do with, I don't know what, routing maybe or whatever. So they had to change all of their code, which is quite hard to do. So if you start using technology too early, I'll skip back because I want to show you this movie clip, because it's from one of my favorite movies, and I cannot promote it enough. How do I start it now? Probably, press it with my mouse button. There it goes. This is the movie. And this is about us as developers, right? Have you seen this movie? If not, you should. It's a great movie. So here we are, all these developers on the platform, and you can see a project manager coming in a few seconds. And we're walking all this direction. We're checking out every framework that we can find and trying to find a framework that will suit our needs. See, there's the project manager. And then we get on the track. So we start using one of these frameworks, right? So there we go with ASP.NET MVC beta. And we see oh no, we have to go somewhere else. We're not using this anymore, we start using a new framework. So we're coming up on the other platform. There we go. Oh yeah. So it is very hard to decide what is the good moment to start using a particular framework. So the movie is called Les Vacances de Monsieur Hulot. It's a French movie from the 50s. See, we as developers, and I see that all the time, we jump from track to track. We do, because we love new technology. That's in our veins, right, as developers. And that's okay, but you have to be really careful about doing that, because the world changes very, very fast. Another thing is, if you start using a particular framework, like nhibernate, who of you is using nhibernate? Or Hibernate, that is, in Java. Well, okay, yeah, we're using Hibernate. Yep. So the thing is, I looked at this list, and what appeared to me that there were two frameworks. I asked, so which of the following open source framework did you use in your project? And people said, well, yeah, we're using bin Hibernate, and there's even more people using log4net. Much more than any of the other frameworks that I investigated at the time. This is a long time ago. You couldn't come up with a list these days because it's too long, right? You probably should ask an open question for this. So it appeared to me that was seems to be quite coincidental, that there's two of these frameworks that really stand out from the other ones. What do you think the reason for that is? Oh yeah, you're a quiet audience, right? So okay, I'll tell you then. So this is code from nhibernate. I hope they had changed that in a more recent version. So what you see here is that there is a protected static read-only ilog. And it's creating a logger, as it should, right, if you start logging this stuff. But the thing is, this particular interface and this particular class do not come from nhibernate. They come from a different framework, right? They come from log4net. So if you use nhibernate, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to be aware of the fact that nhibernate is depending on the log manager class and the ilog interface from log4net, which basically means if you already are using a different logging framework, like the enterprise library logging block, for instance, which has slightly different interfaces and slightly different methods and enumerations and stuff, and you are also going to use nhibernate, you're suddenly stuck with two different logging frameworks. That might be a bit too much. Maybe you want to log everything twice, or just log everything that nhibernate does to one thing and then everything your application does to something else. You could probably do that, but you have to be aware of the fact that these dependencies are there. To give you another example, I was writing some code, some JavaScript code again. I'll show you the code. I'll probably have it open on my laptop, just as a, well, hopefully this works. This is not my fastest laptop I have, because I always travel around with this very little laptop that has not enough memory in it, etc., etc. So I'll show you one of my ASP.NET web pages. So I wanted to use tags in my application. So I thought there must be some JavaScript tag framework out there, right? You just typing in tags, just like on Stack Overflow, wherever you could do it. So this is a work item administration, and we wanted to type in the tags. So I thought, well, let's find out if there is a tagging framework, right? There are quite a few. So I looked at two, and I thought, well, this one probably meets my needs. So I started implementing that, and this is my JavaScript code, very simple, straightforward code, and it does the work as I wanted it to do. So I can now add tags to it. But what I didn't realize is that it is depending on another JavaScript framework. It's actually, this version of it is depending on Bootstrap. And I wanted to do some other stuff, so it's also using Bootstrap type ahead. So type ahead was, I still don't know the history about it. It's either moved out of Bootstrap framework or it's moved in later as it was a separate framework first. It's either one of those. I cannot figure it out. I have to look at the history, and I don't want to do that. So suddenly, I want to use this very tiny framework called Tags Manager that only does this, just allows me to type in tags on an input field, and I'm suddenly stuck with Bootstrap, which I don't mind getting stuck to, but if they change Bootstrap, and they will, what will happen to this code? And I use this code in a lot of spaces in my application, a lot of locations. So I'm suddenly depending on something that I don't have any need for. And still it's there, and I cannot get rid of it. the one thing I thought of doing was looking at the code of the Tags Manager framework, which is not, it's a small bunch of JavaScript code. I thought, you know what? At one point in time, I thought, I don't want this dependency on these other frameworks. I'm going to rewrite it, right? I'm going to write my own Tag Manager framework. Well, luckily for that, I didn't have the time to do that, because it's nice work, but it doesn't add any value to what I already had. But you can get depending on stuff that you don't realize at first, and that's not always a good case, because these frameworks change. And another example, who of you was in Michael Kennedy's talk yesterday afternoon? Like, he was discussing the NuGet packages, right? He created a new ASP.NET MVC 5 application, and then he started updating the NuGet packages for this particular application, because he said, well, basically, as soon as you do this, it will not have the latest version, so you need to get the latest version, except for jQuery. Because jQuery moved to version 2 in the meantime, and if you put out an alert, just a simple alert, that will work on most browsers, but not on IE 6 and 7. So if he would have moved to a jQuery 2, that means that in some browsers, the rest of his code, if he's using alerts, just as an example, doesn't work anymore, right? That's not a dependency you want to have. Let's see if I can move back to my slide deck now. Yeah, back already. Wow. That is, I'm back now. So the thing is, frameworks version. They actually do. Usually for the better, so it's a good thing, but they also sometimes change, and they are not always backwards compatible. And you have had that experience. It's the same with movies, right? Movies version as well. Well, there is one big difference between the versions of Rocky and frameworks. Frameworks usually get better over time, right? So this is, I took some quotes from websites, and it's very interesting to read this stuff. And if you look at websites of frameworks, you should delve into these kinds of quotes. Like, this is one from the Workflow Foundation library, and it says, as we were designing Workflow Foundation 4, we wanted to address the feedback and pain points that we have gathered over the past few years from the community. Here, that's good, right? They listen to us. They actually do, by the way. And then they say, well, blah, 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 blah. Don't know what that means, but as we expanded Workflow Foundation, it became clear that the Workflow Foundation 3.x architecture just wasn't created with the above in mind. That's not good, right? If you're using the 3.x version, you think, uh-oh. And then they say, if you are currently writing workflow code, please do not use the code activity anymore. What if I just build an application for a bank, in this particular case, that just did that? They built all their activities around the code activity. So code like this, so this is some levels down, more down, I think, but and they had to move to version 4 just to get the stuff out that they needed to get out, and they had to change a large part of their code again. And you have to realize that these things will happen to you every now and then. Same goes for this one, Enterprise Library. I was surprised to read this, that they said, well, this release has also retired the following 3 blocks. The caching application block, the cryptography application block, and the security application block. So what if I'm using these? This must be rather disruptive if you're reading this and you just made use of this. I don't know if you did. Do you? Does anyone of you use any of these 3 blocks? Okay. Did you realize this?
Yeah, we want to upgrade every time.
Yeah, okay, well. Yeah. Do you like that? Getting stuck with an old version? Not really, right? That's the problem. I'm glad somebody, well, I'm not glad you have the problem, but I'm glad the pattern is recognizable. Let's put it like this. And it happens all the time. Who of you is using reflection? Okay, a lot of you are not using reflection. Why not? Because it's fun to use, right? So they said this. With .NET 4.5, they said, well, evolving the reflection API. When I started reading this, I was thinking, oh, no, don't do this. We depend on it so heavily in our frameworks, right? And this is not good. So I started reading this and said, well, as many developers have noticed, that is not a good sentence to start with, right? as many developers have noticed. What kind of crap is that? The reflection APIs changed in the .NET API set for Windows Store apps. Yeah, okay, I realize that. That's okay, we're not in trouble yet. Much of .NET's ability to offer a consistent programming model to so many platforms over the last 10 years has been the result of great architectural thinking. Yeah, probably. The changes to reflection are here to prepare for the challenges over the next decade. How do you know? What challenges are they talking about? I don't know, and I would be surprised if they know, but anyway, so they are going to change the reflection API. And I started reading further, and they said, well, we are splitting system type into two concepts. I thought, oh, no, because I use system type quite a lot in my code. And they said, well, in order to achieve a similar split for the system type concept and class, we created a new system reflection type info class. Did you notice? Is nobody using 4.5? Oh, okay, yeah. Well, it's early in the morning. So we rely heavily on this thing, right? On the system type. We do a lot of reflection when it comes to all kinds of stuff, like working with domain objects and binding into to our forms, or getting stuff back into persistence and remapping stuff around. And you use reflection for quite a lot of things, right? And you're very much depending on the type class. So what we had to do is stuff like this. We had to write sort of a wrapper for our code to still work, like with the get method that used to be on the type class. We actually had to work around it, so we created an extension method. I like extension methods. They help get you around these things, right? Does everybody know what an extension method is, by the way? Is there anybody of you who doesn't? Well, the Java world doesn't know. They'll get that in like 2020 or something. As soon as they figured out how to do generics right. And did you know in Java, generics is only a design time feature?
Yes, it's really bad.
It is awful. I just started typing Java code again a few weeks ago. And I was like, oh yeah, we're going to do some generic stuff, blah, blah, blah. And I was typing ahead, thinking that it would work. It didn't. I was like, how can this not work? This is basically the same as it is in .NET, right? And they said, well, not quite. It's only design time. So that means at runtime, I cannot figure out what my actual type is. I was like, what's the point in this, right? They don't have a generic list class. They just have a list class, or an array list, or whatever they have. Or we have, right? For the Java developers, we only have an array list, right? That's good. We don't have all this generic nonsense. And well, they are getting lambda expressions now. So I suppose Google has been in trouble with 1.2 million people trying to figure out what a lambda expression is. Anyway, so we sort of got around this, and we had to rewire our whole API using the reflection stuff, because using a get method on a type class, on a type, wasn't possible anymore, because it just wasn't there. So in our code, we had this get method in a lot of locations. So we had to create a very thin layer between the new type info class and finding out what the declared methods are, and hopefully these will return the same methods as the previous get method did, which they don't. So it's tough, and you pull in some parameters and stuff, and we could get it working again. It took us like 2 weeks to rewire our frameworks. And I didn't like that. Actually, I didn't do it. A friend of mine did that for us, and he did a nice job. But you have to rewire stuff. And that happens, right? Oh, here's my tag page, right? This is a website called www.speedbird9.com. It's just some free advertising, right? It's a free online website to do Kanban boards and stuff. And I wanted to, my team and I are building this stuff. It's out there, by the way. You can just use it, and it's for free, and it will stay for free. So I wanted to do this, right? Get these tags out there and just be able to type this in. And then, well, that's the story I just told you. This is the code again. I didn't realize that I got so dependent on this particular framework and the frameworks that are underneath this framework. So for instance, I was using a particular version of this little tags manager framework, which seems to be quite simple, right? You can just say, okay, here's the tag manager, and it works on anyone with this, and any input with this class. on it, and you can capitalize the first letter and stuff and say, okay, you cannot have, in this particular case, it means you can have as many tags as you like. I only wanted to have 5, so I put in 5, and there's the additional class you can do for the layout and stuff. And so it works quite nice, right? And then I start reading the documentation, which is only one single web page, and it said something like this, because I need to store the tags somewhere, right? They need to be stored in another hidden field, so I can actually pull it out and persist it. So, and then they had this field for that. They said, well, this one, it has just the name of an input, a hidden input on your page. And they said, well, the hidden tag list name is now deprecated as of version 2.4 of this particular very small framework. I thought, well, what version am I using? Because I couldn't get my code to run, right? And I checked it, and I said, well, users will be replaced in 3.0 with hidden tag list ID. I thought, okay, yeah, I am using 3.0. So I'm now using this one, hidden tag list ID. So it's the ID of a control somewhere on your page that you can actually store these tags into. So if you wish to use your own explicitly defined hidden field to store tags, yes, I wanted to do that, so I used this one. And it still didn't work. And I thought, okay, this might be a good point in time where I'd look actually into the code of my little framework. And I found out that they had changed the implementation, and they didn't document that. So now they need a jQuery expression here to find the control yourself. And it's now called output. It's the same feature. And they changed it 3 times in about a year. And I needed to do this because they had some additional features to it. So I got stuck with that. And I didn't like it. And then I wanted to create something else. I wanted to use, I wanted to have a drop-down list with all the possible values that I could use for this particular tag field in some occasions. And I started looking at that, and I thought, okay, it's using Bootstrap already. There must be something in Bootstrap that already does this for me. That's how I got hooked into Bootstrap Type Ahead, and I started using that, and I couldn't get the styles right, and I thought, okay, let's do something else. So I investigated jQuery UI autocomplete, and that works okay. I could style it, so I just put it in, but now I had a dependency on jQuery UI. And then I started looking through my web pages, and I already had some dependencies on jQuery UI in my code for other stuff. But that was a version previous to the version I was using. So then I needed to figure out, okay, when are we using this other version? What does it do? And does it still work in the new version of jQuery UI? All of you who have been working with JavaScript frameworks will get into this trouble. And I'm an old guy, right? Being an old C# Java developer who likes statically typed languages instead of the dynamically, I can work with this, but I do prefer some more statically typed stuff. And it gives me a better idea of where I am, right? And these JavaScript frameworks, there's so many of them, they will outnumber the open source .NET and Java frameworks within a couple of years. And nobody will know what to do. And we are creating the new legacy here, right, with JavaScript. So I just wanted to say that. Doesn't have any relation to the topic, though, but okay. So here it goes, right? Here is jQuery 2.0. Here's another quote that should warn you about moving to new versions just to do it. So if you're automatically updating your NuGet packages every day, you might go into this trouble, right? So as promised, this version leaves behind the older IE version 6, 7, and 8. If you still have to support 6, 7, or 8, which hopefully you don't, but well, 8 is quite normal, right? So my client needs me to support 8. And so, okay, then they said, well, but don't worry, the jQuery team will support the 1.x branch, which does run on IE 6, 7, and 8. That's cool, right? So how long do you think they will continue to do that? Because it's not the work I would want to do, right? So they now have version 1.11 out. It's not something I would want to support if I was the jQuery UI team. I wanted to move on from 2.0 to 2.1, etc., etc. So if you still need to support the IE 6, 7, and 8 browsers, and you are automatically updating your jQuery, or just using a new version of jQuery because you are using another framework that uses features from it, well, you have to be really careful with this stuff, right? So that's the point I'm trying to make. So, a bit about software architecture, and a sip of water. So, the thing is, I do a lot of, well, let's call it audits. It's not really audits, but, well, let me explain briefly. At Capgemini, because we're a global company, we have projects all around the world, right? And there's projects that get into trouble. They just do, right? So they can call up to head offices in Paris and say, I want to have a flying squad, which basically means they get some experts from some other countries in the group to fly into the project and look at the project and try to get it running again. So I do that like, I don't know, 3 to 4 times a year and go to strangest locations like one of the studios in Hollywood, for instance, where we did a project. It was quite fun, actually. Or strange locations. Anyway, if I look at these projects and if I look at the technology they are using, one of the first questions I ask, the first question I ask to the project managers, how far are you how far are you in the project? What's the percentage of work that you've actually done? But that's more the topic I did yesterday. And if I talk to the developers and the architects, the first question is, show me a picture of your software architecture. That sounds like a reasonable question, right? It is. I can tell you it is. It is. And you'd be surprised how many teams and projects do not have such a picture. So that is really tough, right? So if then I ask, so what is your software architecture? What does it do? Could you explain it to me? Could you draw it on a whiteboard or something? A lot of the teams don't come any further than saying, okay, yeah, well, we use ASP.NET MVC for our UI and our process layer, and we use whatever, and Hibernate or Enterprise Entity Framework for persistence, and we do some stuff in between. And I asked them, did you ever hear of something called domain-driven design? And they say, what? So, yeah, domain-driven design. Do you have a domain layer or what? Stuff like that, right? I have these conversations over and over again with teams. And it's fun to do. You can teach them stuff like domain-driven design and work a bit with modeling and stuff. So the thing is, a framework of a good architecture is not something that is a list of frameworks. Good architecture is thinking about, this is by the way Java architecture, is about thinking about what are the things that do the work in my application. What are the layers or components that these elements are in, and how do they work together? So you get pictures like this. Oh, it's gone. Pictures like this. This is an architecture we use quite a lot. It has a number of layers. It's a layered architecture. I'm not saying layered architectures are always good, but this is one we use frequently. And it has a number of elements in there. Stuff like, well, you might think like pages, forms, or controls, or panels on your UI layer. We have use cases and workflow elements and activities in the process layer. And we have a domain layer always with domain objects and entities, or whatever you might call them, factories, repositories, enums, value objects, references, some sort of mapping, stuff that is always there, right? These are the patterns that we apply in our domain layer. It's just patterns. Most of these patterns you can find, by the way, these patterns you can find in Eric Evans's domain-driven design book, which you probably should have all read or are going to read over the next few months. It's a very good book. And there's patterns in every one of these layers. Like if I have a data services layer, it's basically a layer that helps your domain objects to go outside of your application to whatever you do, buses or databases, if you do databases. My current project does not have a database, for instance, or if you go and grab some services or whatever you do. So this is a layer in between that sets that up for you. So it has stuff like service locators, service gateways, table gateways. Those are the patterns that apply there, right? So this is just an example. But what it does is it shows the responsibilities of these elements in these particular layers. And it will also show, if you look one level deeper into this architecture, the responsibilities of these particular elements. So what does a domain object do? What is it for? What does a factory do? What does an aggregate do? What does a repository do? What's the job of a service locator? And there's lots of mechanisms in place that help you decide on that. For instance, you can use simple stuff like CRC cards. You've ever heard of them? It's a very old technique, right? You write under classes, and you write underneath the responsibilities, that's the R. And the second C is the collaborations. So this is my class. What does it do? Or my type of class, actually, the pattern. So what does it do, and who does it need to do that? And that's a great way of talking about these responsibilities for these classes. So what I think you should do in your project is first think about, what are my architectural requirements for this? what does this application actually need to do? I'll give you one ugly example, is we are building the global websites for a very large company right now. Those are 54 websites with over 450,000 pages in it. And it uses a large content management system, etc., etc. And they figured out that this particular system needed to be able to handle 4,000 to 5,000 concurrent users. That is quite a heavy load. It is a very large website. And they just didn't build the architecture to feature that. So they had this requirement, non-functional requirement if you want, for a large number of people to be at the website at the same point in time, and they didn't build the architecture to feature that. That was a horrible mistake, I can tell you. Interesting project it was. And then you set up your architecture. And whether you do that in a layered way, or if you use a component way of, or if you use Simon, did anybody of you visit Simon Brown's workshop on Monday? No, okay. Well, he has a concept of what he calls 4 Cs. So he splits up things in containers and components and classes. And it's a view on architecture, right? But there is a view on architecture. So you set up your architecture. And then you try to figure what the elements inside your layers or your components are, and what do they do? So my current client builds primarily components. It's an insurance company, and they have components for just about everything. And these components have a particular architecture. It has a very thin service layer, and it has their own domain objects, and it has something that needs to persist the domain objects into a database, whatever database. Whether it's an object database, or whether it's a NoSQL database, or it's just an Oracle database, there's a layer that arranges that. So most of these components have 3 layers. And there's elements in there that do the work. And you have to describe the responsibilities, and only then is it time to map the things you want your application to do, or the things you want your software architecture to do, to map those to frameworks that you might be using to do that. Right? So my requirement first is, okay, I will need some concept of domain objects, and I need to persist those. That's a very simple concept, right? So I want to look at a framework that actually does that for me without getting too dependent on the framework, because the next step that you need to do is create a very thin layer. I usually refer to that as an umbrella that actually guards your code from the ugly outside world, being a lot of these frameworks. I would suggest to build a very thin layer in between your actual application code and the framework you're using, just so you can move a little bit away from the direct dependencies on those frameworks. Because as I've shown you earlier, those will eventually kill you, or it will take time to move to new versions, right? And that's tough. I've been there. So I show you some very, very small patterns to do that. The first one of them being the most logical one that I've ever seen in my life. The actual description and the name from this one comes from a book by Martin Fowler called Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. That is a classic, just as domain-driven design is. It's probably on my top 5 list of books to read in this field. The layer supertype pattern is a very, very simple pattern. It is an empty pattern. And in my current project, I have a hard time convincing my developers that we should actually do this. Because they say, well, yeah, we're an agile team. We only do things if we need them. So why do we need to create this empty class that you're suggesting? Because it doesn't do anything. And it adds a layer of abstraction, so we don't need it. And I said to them, well, let me suggest to do this. And we start doing this, and if in 3 months' time there is no code in this particular layer supertype class, then I'm going to buy a crate of beer for you. That's my actual prompt, right? So, so what does a layer supertype do? Well, it doesn't do anything. And the funny thing is, I was listening to Michael Kennedy talking yesterday, and he said, in his keynote at MVC, the first suggestion that he gave, because he gave 18, and the first suggestion was exactly this one. If you are using a framework, and it has its own, what I call layer supertypes. So a layer supertype, I probably should explain first what a layer supertype is. It's a class that sort of represents stuff that you are going to do. Well, it's very hard to describe what it actually is. Did I put a decent description on here? So it acts as a supertype for all types in its layer, or in its component, or whatever it does. And all the types that are of the same type inherit from your layer supertype. So to give you a concrete example is, if I have a bunch of domain objects sitting in my application, like I have customer and product and order and stuff and whatever I might have, you can say, okay, these are all domain objects. What if I would inherit those all from a class called domain object? Does make sense, right? And you've probably all done that. But you probably didn't realize that it's called a layer supertype. And you can do that for many more things. For instance, if you would use ASP.NET-MVC, there's a controller class in ASP.NET-MVC. It is their layer supertype. So the thing, what I would do first, and it's the same suggestion Michael Kennedy made yesterday, I would first create my own controller class that inherits from controller and call it like my controller, base controller, root controller, core controller, whatever kind of fancy name you might have for it. And make sure that all my developers who are writing controllers in ASP.NET-MVC, just to say, yep. A what? Well, not for changes, but it's for future use. Yeah, well, there's a different pattern for doing that, by the way, but you can also use layer supertypes for that. So to illustrate your particular example, I would never inherit directly from entity object. What I would do is create a class that has an entity object inside, that wraps the entity object, and use that as the root for my domain object. Just an example of how you might possibly do this. We did that, by the way, in a couple of projects. So there's always a way around this. So the thing is, you don't want to be that depending on it. The thing is, if you do that for controller, for instance, if you have, so that's what layer supertype does. It starts as an empty class. And you just start inheriting all your domain objects or all your controllers from it. And you will realize at some point in time that two of these controllers or two of your domain objects are having similar behavior. And as soon as you identify that, you can move it up into your layer supertype. That's how the pattern works, right? It just, new functionality comes in. So if you look at our domain object class, for instance, it has an ID, it has a title property, it has a basic constructor, basically stuff like that, right? And it grows on you. And the good thing about it is if you start doing that, so here's an example, here's my home controller, it's inherits from controller. I would much rather have my own layer in between. And there's another reason for that, is that if the implementation of their controller class changes, you will be able to handle that in your own base controller, root controller, whatever you might call it. So if some function changes, you can handle that. And layer supertype is a good pattern for doing that. So it keeps you away from changes in the framework you use. And it also creates your own thin layer of independence. And the good thing is, if you look at your architectural picture, and you have something like this, I'm not saying copy this, but this is just an example, what you will see is that the elements in here, like the domain object, like the factory, the repository, the gateway, the page, who of you has a base page if you build web applications? Right, that's the same pattern essentially. We do that too. And the same goes for stuff that's in your process layer, if you have a process layer. I would do this for any one of these elements in my software architecture. I not only say I would do this, I do this. And it helps me structure my code. It maps my architecture to my code directly. If you would dive into my code bases I have on my laptop, they all, a lot of them actually use this specific application architecture. And I could literally show you where these elements are in my very thin layer framework that I use in between. Just to save some time, I'm going to show that on slides. So here's a domain object class, a contact class that inherits from a domain object, right? The domain object class started out as an empty class. As I'm pretty sure that when they designed ASP.NET-MVC, as an example, they started off with the same thing. They started off with an empty controller. Just started using it to see what kind of behavior will be in there, in those controllers. And they started pulling up things into the controller class. That's the way you can actually build on those frameworks. So the good thing is, if you have a layer supertype class like that, you can code the rest of your functionality against that layer supertype, because it will work for anyone any class that inherits from your layer supertype, right? So I have a save compositions method here as an example, and it uses a domain object. It doesn't use a contact or a product or an order or whatever it then might have. It uses a domain object. What we actually did, by the way, is even create an interface on top of that, and usually use the interface to do the mapping on and the functionality on. And the same goes for this one. This is an extension method, and extension methods are always good for these kinds of types. So I have a method called validate that is actually working on a domain object. So I can say, for any domain object that I have, I can say myContact.validate. Bang, it's done, right? So these layer subtypes help you to do this stuff, and it creates a very thin layer of independence between your code and possible frameworks that you might have. So that is a pattern I would always recommend. But I would say that most of you are already doing this, but probably not as aware of that as you are probably now. So do this for most of your architectural elements, and it will help you describe the responsibilities between those elements. So the next pattern is, this is a really, really small one. And it's a funny one. I hope I pull out one slide that I usually have in this deck, because the joke only works in Dutch. So I'll just show you the code and not the description, because the code is much more interesting. So in my framework, so if you build up a little bit of framework, there is occasionally the need for using enumerations, right? Like I want to have statuses or log levels, or in this particular case, it's a list of tasks that the application can perform. And as this is in my framework, and a lot of my projects use this framework, I need to be able to write code against that, let's say, enumeration. So this looks like an enumeration, right? A bounded list of values that you might have, that you might select one from, right? So in this particular class, this class is in my framework. Framework is called ADF. And it's in the task manager, and it says, okay, I can run this task, and it has this name. And it comes from an enumeration. Well, the thing with enumerations, so I can use it, but I want to use it like this. So this is actually application code. It says, this is the name of my project, and it says 84task.selectCompany. I want to start this task. Just do this task. But the thing is, this thing is not the same as this thing, because using enumerations gives you some limits. So this is a very stupid example here. Saying, okay, I have an enum with levels, high, low, medium. So I can write a service or a method against that, saying, okay, I'm going to validate a level. And the type of this parameter is called levels, because it's the enumeration. But what if at some other architectural level, I'm using the word level now on 2 levels, 3 levels now. Oh, that's 4. Sounds like the Spanish Inquisition. So I want to have in my application, I want to make use of that and extend that one. But the thing is, with enumerations, you cannot inherit from enumerations, right? So I cannot say application levels inherits from levels, and I have extreme and extra heavy, and I want to use the same service. So that's not possible. But I just found out that in Java, you can actually have an enumeration, implement an interface. You cannot do that in .NET, right? But it's different. So it gives a different view on this particular pattern, by the way. So that is good. So this is not possible, right? So what most people will do is they will say, you know what? This is the joke I was pulling out. This only works in the Netherlands because this thing is called a string. So this is a collection of strings, right? But it doesn't work in other languages. And if you go to the US, they actually ban you from conferences if you do this. I had this slide at TechEd US. I had this one in my slide deck. And they didn't particularly like that, actually. They wanted me to pull it out, but it was too late because I had already done the talk. As I should have gotten this out because it only works in Dutch. But anyway, what people will do is they will create a collection of strings, right? So they will have, let's say, okay, I'm going to create my class called levels. Now it's a class, not an enum anymore. And it will say public read-only static string high, medium, low, etc., etc. So I can still write code like this, right? Validate level, levels high. But the thing is, there is a big difference. But, well, you can inherit from a class, so I can have, at some other point in my code, I can have a class that inherits from levels and say, oh, I have my application levels, extreme and extra heavy, whatever. And I can call it like this. That's good. But I can also call it like this, because the type of my service is not anymore levels, it's string, which makes it type in safe. There's lots of examples of that, by the way, in code where people use strings too heavily. I'm not really fond of that. So the thing is, I want actually to create something which is working like an enumeration, but which I can inherit from. Because I want to use the enumeration both in my framework code, which cannot be dependent on my application code, right? But I also want to be able to extend it in my application code. I'll show you the real code example, by the way. So am I going to do that? No, I don't have the time for doing that, right? So what we did is we created something we put a name on it. We call it a descriptor. You can call it any way you like. I don't mind. It's just what we did is we created a class, the application task class in this particular example, that has public static read-onlys of the same type. So it is a class. But it sort of looks like an enumeration if you use it, right? So it has a bunch of static read-onlys. They don't have any state to it, by the way, so they're reasonably thread safe. And they have the same type, which means if I write code using this particular class, I can actually create a type safe. So I can have the type of my parameter being application task and not being string, right? And because it is a class, I can extend from it. I'll show you the implementation from one of the applications I have on my laptop. I want to show some real code, of course. I'm not going to type in code. I will be typing code in tomorrow, by the way, and generating code as well. So where did I put it? So this is one from one of my current projects. We use this pattern a lot. See, these are the tasks on Speedbird 9, which is the online Kanban board we have. So Speedbird 9 has a task called import from TFS. It has a task called import work items, import from XMI, import from Excel, blah, 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 blah. A whole bunch of them out there. And we can actually call on those from anywhere in the application. So if you look at the actual class that is in our framework, it's called the task manager, and it allows me to run using a provider, but that's the next pattern I'll get to run a specifically application task. So this particular one is in the framework, right? It only has a few items in it, and the Speedbird 9 task class just inherits from it. So I should have brought my mouse. See? It just inherits from application task, which means that I can use the instances of Speedbird 9 task in the code, in the run method that I have in my framework. So it works as an enumeration. It is type safe, and still I can inherit from it. This particular pattern solves a lot of issues for me because I have to write this particular framework, right? I'll show you an example of the way you could use this. Again, I'm going to look at ASP.NET MVC, an older version of it. Oh dear. I needed my slide back. PowerPoint has crashed. Oh, it's back. Wow, that was a quick recovery. It usually doesn't recover that quick. So one example of this would be, where is it? This is the code I already shown. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. So this is code from ASP.NET MVC, right? And the thing I don't like about ASP.NET MVC is this particular line of code. I should check actually whether in version 5 they had actually changed this stuff, or in previous version. I haven't used it in quite a while. So it says, this is a class called HTML helper, and it has a method called action link, and these are the parameters you provide. So this one is called the action, and this one is your controller. So they refer to it in strings, which means if you rename your controller, unless you're using stuff like resharp or something, it will actually not find the right controller. Or if you rename the action in your controller, it again will not find the particular action. So what we did for this is we created an extension method on the HTML helper. We call it link, just to be sure. So it has a string, that's the text you use on the link, and it has two of these descriptors. So I have one called controller and one called actions, and those are lists of the actions and the controllers you have in your application. So it makes it a bit more safe to use, right? So this is a particular example of using this particular descriptor pattern. So there's one more, and it talks a bit about dependency injection. Who of you is doing dependency injection? Everybody of you. So if you look at dependency injection, there's different ways of doing dependency injection. Let me briefly illustrate it, and I have to get rid of these text balloons. It's too much. So dependency injection is basically a good thing. The thing I see in code bases around the world is that people, in my opinion, tend to overuse it. They'd use it for anything in the kitchen sink that you might have, anything that you might have in your application. Especially in the Java world, if you have like an enterprise Java and you run it on, for instance, JBoss or whatever, everything is sort of injected into your code, right? And it's very hard to see what the clean code would actually be looking like, because they inject anything, and they used to do that basically with a lot of XML configuration, and they moved that into what we in the .NET will call attributes, and in the .NET world, or in the Java world, is called annotations. So everything is annotated with the keyword inject, and it just happens automatically. And I don't know, it gives me the wrong feeling about, you know, it's like I create one class and then my whole application explodes, something like that. And it's, for a starting developer, that is very hard to see, and it is very hard to write, let's say, decent code to it. So I'm not against dependency injection, because we rely on it heavily, but not to do everything, right? So if you look at it, there's different ways of doing that. What you will see mostly is that people will use constructor injection, right? So if an instance of a class gets created, the dependency injection engine will look through the constructors, find the one with the most parameters, and tries to create an instance of those classes as well, and pass them in as a parameter. So then it goes off and creates the other ones and look at the constructors of those. So it sort of blows up your whole application if you want to. Or inflates your whole application, let's call it like that, that's much better. And then there's also the other ways to use property injection. So you can annotate, depending on the dependency injection you use, the engine you use, with attributes or annotations on your properties, saying, okay, if I have an instance of this particular class instantiated, then it will go through the properties and see, okay, I need to create this one, I need to create this one, etc., etc. Those are both ways are sort of automatically injecting everything that you need. That you can also do it manually, of course. We do that for a number of things and a number of reasons. It gives you a bit more control over what you do. You can just ask the dependency injection engine, could you please create everything that you can find for this particular interface, for instance? And it will create a single object or a whole bunch of objects, and depending on the lifetime they have, they do different things, right? But you can do that. And we use it for things that we have on the side. So we have a pattern that we call manager provider. And it's the thing, there is a manager. The manager doesn't do anything. Makes sense, right? So here's the manager. This is a validation manager. And in this particular case, it has an IEnumerable of iValidation policies. So this is an interface in our framework. So it has a whole bunch of them. And we create them just in time. We could have also done this with the lazy functionality in .NET 4, but this code is slightly bit older than. So we just say to a thing called Object Factory, that's our dependency injection engine, or at least it plugs in a dependency injection engine, and we say, okay, give me everything that implements the iValidation policy that I've configured to be created, right? And it creates a whole bunch of these policies. So the code we now have is that, so here's the configuration in XML. It's horrible. We stopped doing that. And there's two reasons for doing that. I hate writing XML. I just don't like XML. I'm not in favor of XML. And it also is very prone to typing errors. You know, if I make a typing error in the namespace or whatever, well, things will blow up in my face. And also, it doesn't give me an idea of which namespaces I need to include into my project. So these days, we rather do it like this, right? So this is a far easier way of configuring your dependency injection. So for instance, for the data providers, I will create two, one for my application and one for something called smart reference, whatever that may be. And for my authorization provider, I plug in this particular one. There's actually code from an existing project. And assumingly, it sends mail out through a dummy mail provider, Good. Doesn't do anything, by the way. And I have a Web3 provider plugged into IFV provider, stuff like that. This is basic configuration stuff, right? This is much easier to read. It's also not prone for typing errors because it has to compile, right? This is in this particular case, it's in my global ASX. So what do we use this for? Well, the mechanism is, I'll show you the picture again, is this. This is the pattern that we use for a lot of these things. So there is a manager, and the manager has one or more instances of the interface, in this particular case, iValidation policy. And I can create different policies. So here's 3. Here's one that validates business rules, that validates compositions, one that's validating attributes, but you can write a whole bunch to them, right? It doesn't really matter as long as you implement this particular policy, this interface. So the validation manager just has a method called validate, and the method called validate does nothing more than calling on these particular iValidation policies. This is what we call the providers in the pattern, and we'll just delegate them to these specific providers, and they will do the actual work. Which means that I can configure somewhere in my application which of these things actually do the work. And there is a good reason for doing this, but I'll show you the code first. So here's my interface. I'll give you the same example here. Here's my iValidation policy interface. And it has a method called validate, and it has some overloads on that. And basically, if I look at it, so here's my validation manager again. It builds up a bunch of policies, and these policies are, oh, again, there's the, oh, hey, didn't I have that already? Wow. So here's the validate method on my validation manager. It's a static method on a static class, and it just says, well, go through all the policies and call on the method validate. So the manager doesn't do any real work, right? As I suggested earlier. So this is basically how it works. The thing is, now all my code can do stuff like this. I can say validation manager.validate role, and it just validates depending on what I have plugged in, right? And if I do that, I can even take it up one little step, is that I can create an extension method or a bunch of extension methods that do the same thing, that just call on the validation manager, and there are overloads for, and they use the domain object to do it. So I can write role.validate now, which is somewhat cleaner code, and you can actually make it fluent if you have more stuff like this. And so there's a bunch of reasons that we do this. So here's actual code like project.validate. It just validates. So reasons for doing this is quite a few. For instance, if you use, so one of the implementations we have is a log manager. We have our own log manager. It doesn't do anything. It just has a bunch of iLog providers plugged in, and it will delegate the work to those. So if you are using a logging framework, and you do not want to use it directly, you could use this approach to stay away from it a bit. So the thing is, you define just your own interface, but a log provider interface is really easy to do, by the way. And you have, let's say, an adapter to it that adapts, that implements your interface on top of the, whatever you do, the entity framework, logging block, or log4net, or whatever framework you're using. You can just then plug in this framework into this very, very thin layer that you just created and call on it without having any knowledge of the framework that is underneath. And the same goes for a whole lot of these topics. Like, I think I made a list of this somewhere. Like what we do with task management, we have a mechanism in place that allows us to create use cases in code, as we want the model to be close to our code. But there's also people using a workflow framework to do that. So there's different implementations of my thing called iTask provider, right? And I can just say, run this particular task. I don't really care what framework is underneath. The same goes for managing views. At some point in time, I would write code to a web application, but it could also be to a mobile application or a desktop application, or maybe even a Windows Store application. I don't want to know that. I just want to be able to say, okay, present my view. And the view provider that I've plugged in will take care of the rest. And it's independent of whatever you're doing. Whether you're doing, I don't know what, a HTML5, JavaScript, CSS stuff front end, or ASP.NET MVC, or ASP.NET Web Forms, or whatever you do, it's still the same code. So it also allows us to have less senior developers, far less senior than all of you are here, We have those. They just come out of school, right? They need to learn how to write code. And they can just write code that says, my role.validate. And they don't need to be bothered with how that validates. Or the same goes for binding stuff, like or mapping stuff. I need to map a domain object to whatever, a DTO that sends out to services or whatever. I just can say, my domain object.map to this particular DTO. How it works and how the mapping is done, what framework I'm using for the mapping, I don't really care, because it's independent of what I'm doing. So this is another particular pattern that is quite useful. So basically, to round it up, if you would look at frameworks and architecture and stuff like that, my suggestion would be to follow a recipe similar like this one. So first identify what are the actual architectural requirements. So if your application should run for 5,000 concurrent users, please make sure that your application architecture does supply that facility. So, and you set up your architecture, it doesn't have to be layered, that's why it's in between brackets. It can be components, it can be anything, but we usually build layered architectures. Identify the elements in there, in those layers. Identify what are the responsibilities of those elements and the collaborations they have on elements possibly in other layers or possibly within the same layer. And for the domain layer, I can definitely recommend reading Domain-Driven Design by Eric Evans as an example. And also Martin Fowler's book, and of course the Gang of Four book, which is, well, it was like the Bible to me when I first read it. It's hard to read, but it has good content. And then, only then, try to figure out what frameworks you're using and map them to your application architecture and to the architectural needs that you have. And my suggestion would be that to use patterns like the ones I've shown you to create a little bit of independence between you and those frameworks that you're using, because they will change, right? And to round it up, just to show, oh, I have to press the button again. Again, a clip from Les Vacances de Monsieur Hulot. Very short one, by the way. So this is what happens to your architecture, right? You build, and you think you have it all done, and you figure out all the layers in your architecture, and then somebody has created, that will happen to me next week, created a layer extra, which I didn't reckon on, and things will go horribly wrong in the end, right? So don't overdo your architecture. Don't create layers you don't need, but think about the patterns I've shown you and about moving into architecture. So this is the end of the talk. I barely made it, no, not almost in time. So if you have any more questions about these or other subjects, I'll be here all week until Friday morning, that is. This is my personal website. My email address is here. Both of my email addresses, actually. This is my Twitter hashtag. If you feel the need to tag yourself in the picture I took, you're probably very good in the picture that I took of the audience this morning. So thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference.